The sound came before the image, a thick, constant hiss as if the air itself breathed in static. Then a voice, distant, deep, almost gentle, cut through the noise and said, "You won't remember anything." The silence that followed seemed alive, dense enough to be cut with a blade. It was the first recording of Project Echoes, dated January 1953. No one knows who made the recording, nor who was the subject who heard those words for the first time. All that's known is that, from that point on, memories began to disappear and people. The laboratory where it all began had no windows. The walls were covered with metal panels that returned every sound with a delay, as if the space itself repeated what it heard. The lights flickered in a pale hospital tone. The floor, a mosaic of white tiles, reflected the silhouettes of tired men in lab coats with empty eyes. Everything there smelled of ozone and fear. The narration moves slowly, as if each word needs to overcome an invisible resistance before being spoken. It said that in that room, sound ceased to be merely vibration. It became a scalpel, a tool, a weapon. The government-funded experiments on auditory conditioning, an innocuous expression for something that, in practice, aimed to erase traumas through sensory saturation. But there's a difference between erasing pain and erasing the one who feels it. It was in this blurred line that the project was lost, and with it, all who conducted it. The voice changes tone. It's no longer describing the past. Now it seems to remember. It speaks as one who was there. The first tapes were simple, sounds of rain, waves, inverted choirs. Then came the voices, orders repeated thousands of times until the meaning dissolved. The human brain, it was said, could be rewritten like a magnetic tape. And when you no longer want a memory, you simply overlay the noise. However, there was something the noise couldn't cover, the consciousness of forgetting. It was like erasing a painting, but leaving the frame in the same place. The subjects forgot what they had lived, but felt the absence of something they couldn't name. They became fragments of themselves, remnants of voices that no longer belonged to anyone. The narrator pauses. For an instant, the sound of breathing becomes part of the scenery. We hear the hum of machines, the rhythmic click of an old recorder, and the slight creak of a chair being moved. That's when the name appears for the first time. Alan Price. Young, promising neuroacoustics researcher, hired to assist in auditory reconditioning tests on patients with post-traumatic disorders. His arrival hasn't been told yet, only insinuated, but the narrator seems to know his fate before it even begins. They say Alan believed in sound as art, that he saw beauty in the frequency of things, in the human voice, in the beats of a machine, in the silence between two notes. When he received the invitation to work with Dr. Cameron, director of the Allen Memorial Institute, he thought he was joining a study about healing, but what he found inside was an orchestra of muffled screams and nameless sounds. In the first recording, the noise still dominated everything. The tape trembled on the reel, the hiss grew until it almost hurt, and then again the voice, "You won't remember anything." This time the phrase seemed directed at him. The scene ends almost hypnotically. The imaginary camera traverses the Institute's corridors, showing cables dragging along the floor, flickering lights, metal doors marked with numbers. Behind each of them, a human echo repeating in a loop, like a broken song. Alan hasn't appeared yet, but his shadow is already there, projected on the opaque glass of the recording room, motionless, listening to the sound of his own forgetting. The narration closes the introduction with a low tone, almost a whisper. Everything begins with a sound. The first to hear forgot his name, the second forgot why he was listening, the third forgot there was something to forget. The train arrived in Montreal just before dawn. Thick fog covered the tracks like a blanket of silence, and the distant whistle sounded more like a lament than a warning. Alan Price descended from the car with a dark leather suitcase and a folded envelope in his coat pocket. Inside it, the invitation letter from the Allen Memorial Institute, signed in blue ink by Dr. Ewan Cameron. The name sounded respectable. Authority on the human mind, awards, conferences, publications. Allen didn't imagine, not yet, that name would become a forbidden whisper. The taxi that took him to the institute crossed empty streets, flanked by old buildings and trees that seemed carved from the cold. The city awakened slowly, as if reluctant to remember it existed. The driver didn't speak during the entire journey, only the sound of the engine and the rustle of snow against the glass. When the iron gate opened, Allen had his first view of the place that would change everything. The Allen Memorial Institute rose on a grey hill, with narrow windows and a stone facade covered in moss. It didn't look like a research centre. It looked like an abandoned sanctuary where time had forgotten to move forward. The wind made tree branches beat against the windows, producing a metallic, repetitive sound, a prelude, perhaps, to what he would hear inside. At the entrance, a nurse with an impassive face received him. She asked for his documents without smiling. "Dr. Price, isn't it? The doctor is waiting for you on the second floor." Her voice was low, almost without intonation. Allen responded with a nod and followed the corridor, observing the floor scratched by years of stretchers and boots on wheels. The air smelled of disinfectant and rust. Dr. Cameron awaited him in a room lit by yellowish lamps. His hair was combed back, his gaze clear and distant, like someone observing a painting, not a person. "Ah, our new collaborator, finally." The tone was courteous but cold. He extended his hand with a studied smile, like someone imitating a human gesture without understanding its meaning. "I've heard much about your work in applied acoustics, Allen. Here you'll be able to test it under unique conditions." Allen forced a smile. "I appreciate the opportunity, Doctor. I'm curious to understand the scope of the experiments." Cameron rose slowly, approached a wall covered with recordings and reports. He touched one of the tapes with his fingertips. "Sound, Dr. Price, is the oldest language of the mind. It doesn't convince. It rewrites." Pause. "We don't treat patients with medicine. We treat them with frequencies, and you came to help us make them perfect." Allen nodded, trying to disguise his discomfort. While the director spoke, a constant hum seemed to come from the walls, as if the building were breathing. He looked around but couldn't locate the source. Cameron noticed the gesture. "Do you hear it? It's the sound of our isolation room. Many say it's just air passing through the ducts. I prefer to think it's the echo of what has already been forgotten." They walked together to the testing ward. Through a narrow window, Allen saw a woman sitting in a metal chair, blindfolded, connected to cables coming out of a small recorder. A researcher slowly turned the frequency knob. On the speaker, a whisper repeated the same phrase at regular intervals. Allen didn't understand the words. He only noticed that the woman, with each repetition, trembled a little less, until she stopped completely. "Is the treatment working?" he asked in a contained tone. Cameron smiled. "The treatment is progressing. She no longer feels anything. No pain, no fear, no memory." Allen observed the motionless woman, her face serene and empty. The whisper continued, and for an instant he had the sensation that the sound had changed, that the voice was saying something new, something directed at him. But when he tried to pay attention, the recorder was turned off, and everything returned to silence. Cameron placed his hand on his shoulder. "Rest today. Tomorrow, you'll begin your own study. From now on, sound is your instrument, and the patient, your score." Allen nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the chair. The echo of the voice, that imperceptible whisper, seemed to have lodged itself in some corner of his mind. He didn't know what it said, but he felt he wouldn't be able to forget it. As he left the room, the hum returned, louder, closer, as if the building were murmuring his name. Alan's first experiment happened 3 days later. During that time, he walked through the Institute's corridors like a visitor in a dream. The sounds seemed to repeat at exact intervals: the noise of a metal cart, the click of locks, the dry steps of nurses. Everything fit into a cycle, as if the routine had been choreographed by someone who hated chance. On the morning of the third day, he received a brown folder marked only with the number 9. Inside, a report with short sentences and a photograph glued in the corner. Man, 40-ish, lost gaze, shaved head. Below the image, a word written by hand: echoes. Alan read the notes. The subject, identified as patient 9, had suffered from post-war stress disorder. He had been subjected to various auditory therapies. The last observation in the file said only, repetition, 18 hours, response, partial depersonalization. When he entered the observation room, Alan felt the air vibrate. The sound was low, a continuous frequency, almost imperceptible, but enough to cause discomfort. The patient was seated, bound to the chair by straps on his wrists. His eyes were fixed on an invisible point ahead. Beside him, a reel-to-reel recorder turned slowly, reproducing a male voice that said pausedly, "You are safe. You don't need to remember. You are safe. You don't need to remember." Alan stood still for a while, observing the movement of the tapes turning. This didn't seem like treatment. It seemed like an incantation, an attempt to replace one memory with another, artificially created. He approached the control table and looked at the responsible technician, a pale man with sunken eyes. How long has he been listening to this?" 17 hours and 42 minutes. Without breaks. None. The voice must become the only sound inside the mind. That's how erasure happens. Alan looked at the patient. The man began to repeat the words with a slight delay, like a human echo of the recording, first with hesitation, then with almost perfect synchrony. "You are safe. You don't need to remember." His voice and the tape's voice mixed until they became one. Alan felt something twist inside him. "And when he stops repeating?" he asked. The technician responded without raising his eyes. "When he stops, we'll know the process is complete. He won't remember even how to speak." The sound of the tape increased slightly, an almost imperceptible modulation. The patient trembled, his fingers contracting under the straps. Then the movement ceased. Silence. Alan turned off the recorder. The technician frowned. "You shouldn't have done that." He was in evident pain. Pain is the path to forgetting. Without it, there's no result. The technician's gaze was empty, but there was something there, a calm of someone who had watched this dozens of times. Alan turned to the patient. The man's eyes were open, but there was no focus in them, only reflections of light. He murmured something, almost inaudible. Alan leaned in. "What did you say?" The man responded in a soft, distant tone. "You won't remember anything." Alan recoiled. The phrase was the same as in the old tapes, the undated recordings. "Who said that to him?" he questioned. The technician shrugged. "It's in all the protocols, a base instruction." "But why?" "Because the mind needs an anchor before erasing itself, a final order to obey." Alan noted something in his notebook, trying to keep his voice steady, but the sound of the tape still echoed in his head. Not the noise, but the rhythm. The cadence was identical to the phrase he had heard in the laboratory on the day of his arrival. 3 beats of silence, then the voice. "You won't remember." The experiment officially ended at 7:46 p.m. Alan's report described the process technically, but between the lines, the discomfort was evident. He noted a personal observation at the bottom of the page. The human mind should not be an instrument, and sound should not be used to make silence. That night, back in his lodging room, he tried to sleep, but the sound, a continuous hum like that of the recorder, seemed to come from the walls. He got up, looked for the source, pressed his ear to the wall. Nothing. Only the sound of himself breathing, and in the background a voice whispering, almost gently, "You won't remember anything." The diary began as a habit of control, a way to keep reasoning organized between reports and noises. Alan wrote every night, sitting before the small table in his lodging under the yellowish light of a lamp that squeaked as if it too were tired. At first the notes were methodical: dates, times, frequency parameters, observations about patients. But gradually the tone changed. The sentences became fragmented. The words began to repeat themselves, as if the text itself were being contaminated by the sound. February 8th, 1953. Patient 9 doesn't speak, only breathes in rhythm. When I turn off the tape, he seems to continue listening. So do I. February 10th. Today I noticed the sound doesn't come only from the machines. There's a point on the laboratory wall where the hum is louder. It seems to pulse. February 13th. Slept for 3 hours, I think. When I woke up, the diary was open to a page I don't remember writing. The handwriting is mine, but the words aren't. Alan began to doubt time. The days at the institute seemed too long, stretched, like recording tapes running without stopping. Sometimes he had the impression that the sun rose twice, other times that it never rose at all. In the laboratory, the sounds became familiar. He recognized each tone, each modulation, like recognizing the voices of loved ones. But there was something new, a low frequency, almost imperceptible, that seemed to vibrate only inside his head. No instrument registered it. He called it in his records the phantom sound. February 16th. The phantom sound only appears when I'm alone. I don't know if it's a product of fatigue or if the institute's noise has layers. Perhaps we're only hearing the surface. One morning, Alan noticed the diary pages had been numbered twice. Each entry seemed to have a shadow, a previous version, with small differences. In the second version of each day, the words were drier, almost military, without adjectives, without hesitation, as if another hand, with the same handwriting, were correcting his thoughts. He took the notebook to Cameron. The director leafed through the pages with disinterest. Exhaustion can cause cognitive overlap, Alan. It's normal. Many of our researchers report confusion after long exposures, Alan insisted. But that doesn't explain the exact repetitions. Someone could be tampering with the notes. Cameron stared at him, smiling. Perhaps you're simply hearing too much. Sound has that effect. It creates echoes inside the mind. Sometimes the echo is louder than the original voice. The conversation ended there. But the doubt remained. That night, Alan sealed the diary with adhesive tape and locked it in a drawer. Even so, when he woke the next day, the notebook was on the table, open to a new page. At the top, written in thin letters, "Sound heals what time cannot." He didn't remember writing that, nor having seen that phrase before. But in the following days, it began to appear in unexpected places, in reports by other researchers, on the walls of the testing room, even on the labels of magnetic tapes, as if it were an undeclared motto of the Institute. February 19th. I'm beginning to suspect the research isn't about curing trauma. It's about erasing time. Each recording is a fragment that replaces a memory, and perhaps we're next to forget them. The last pages of the diary show an increasingly paranoid Alan, writing as if trying to anchor his own sanity to paper. He begins to describe not just the experiments, but sensations, echoes, voices, lapses. February 22nd. Today, I found Dr. Cameron in the corridor, but he passed by me as if he didn't know me. In the afternoon, he called me to his office and welcomed me to the Institute. Again, February 24th. I no longer know how many days I've been here. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear patient 9's tape. Other times it's my own voice. It repeats the same phrase, slowly, as if it had all the time in the world. Alan tries to remember the original sound, the exact timbre, but he no longer knows if he's recalling a recording or a dream. The diary, which should help him organize his thoughts, is now a cracked mirror, reflecting incompatible versions of himself. He writes, erases, rewrites, and the sound of the pencil scratching the paper seems to accompany the rhythm of his breathing. At the end of the last page, there's only one phrase. When everything is silence, it will be too late to remember who I was. Alan closes the notebook, looks at the ceiling, and notices the constant hum, the same since the first day. But now there's something new. An interval between the noises, a pause where there seems to be voice, words hidden in the absence of sound. He holds his breath to hear better, and then, right at the limit of audibility, a voice whispers his name. This time, he's certain it's real. Alan woke with the tape already playing. He didn't remember turning on the equipment. He only remembered the weight of his suitcase on his body and the smell of cold coffee in the lodging. The recorder emitted a low hiss, and over it, a breath that seemed to come from inside a tunnel. There was a label stuck to the reel, handwritten in faded ink. Session 47, Dr. A. Collins. The name meant nothing to him at that moment. Then came the voice, his voice, saying, as if this time speaking from the bottom of a well, "If you're hearing this, Alan, it means you've already begun to forget." The pronoun fell into the room like a stone. He rewound, listened again. The same tonality, the same dragged rhythm, but there was something in the intonation that confused him, a painful patience, like someone reading a sentence pronounced for someone who no longer recognizes the letters. There were no records of his about Session 47. The files usually went up to 46. Still, the tape existed and carried instructions written in a voice that came from himself. He looked in the diary for some clue, some line that would justify a recording of his from an earlier date, but the recent pages only showed concerns, repetitions, crossed-out phrases. He then searched through the laboratory files, shelves with boxes in the wind, labels that repeated in monotonous patterns. Echoes, reconditioning, mnemosine, protocol B. The folder marked S47 was hidden among administrative reports, as if someone had placed it there in a rush to erase their own imprudence. Inside, there were reports produced in handwriting that at first glance resembled his. Angular strokes, a certain loosening in the lowercase letters when the pen ran. The dates came and went, as if someone had tried to stitch several calendars on top of each other. Passages jumped out at him, continuous subliminal hearing, recorded increase in limbic activity, subject demonstrates partial dissociation, continuity recommended, unforeseen responses, verbal self-reference detected. On one of the pages, someone had written in the margin, "Note, procedure successfully applied to Subject 1. Subject 1. The expression echoed like a blow. In the following hours, Alan mulled over documents, tapes and notes until his vision hurt. He discovered notes signed by A. Collins, describing sessions that, according to what the letterhead indicated, had occurred in the last 12 days. In all the reports, the same progression: prolonged exposure to modulated frequencies, introduction of repeated linguistic patterns, recording of short memory lapses, then more extensive ones, and clinical comments evaluating the effectiveness of adaptive erasure. On one of the tapes was the sound of a full room, muffled murmurs and the creaking of chairs, then footsteps. And then, without any transition, the voice that was familiar to him, only older, more metallic, declining a protocol. Restart alpha sequence. Insert security anchor. Confirm subject response. Next, a fragment that seemed like a dialogue. Questions and answers that, when listened to carefully, told a farce. He himself, or someone who had learned to imitate him, described details of his own childhood as if they were evidence under oath. Alan felt a fear he couldn't name, not only because he had recorded that, but because, upon hearing it, he had flashes, glimpses of memories he couldn't rely on. A father with rough hands, a room with floral curtains, a laugh that didn't fit into any clear constellation of memory. They were sensations with contours, not images, possible implants of memories sewn into his psychological fabric. He decided to confront the technician responsible for the tape sector, a man named Rourke, who had always seemed more symmetrical than human. Deep eyes, measured speech, the dedication of someone who spends their life leaning against reels. Rourke listened without surprise. When Alan showed him the tapes and reports, he sighed as if all of this were expected. "Whatever you think, Alan," Rourke said calmly, "it's not uncommon for researchers to participate as subjects in protocols. Neutrality is easier when the experience itself is tested from the inside. This is science. This is control." Alan felt the room tighten. "But why my name? Why Collins?" he asked. Rourke let out a short smile. "Some terms and names are used for operational codes. It's not about real identity, it's about controlled variables." His words had the coldness of a manual. Still, they didn't explain the gaps Alan felt. The sensation that his life was interspersed with torn-out pages, vertiginous leaps in the calendar, and returns to days he didn't remember having lived. What terrified him wasn't just the idea of having participated in sessions as a subject, but the possibility that his own trajectory had been constructed post hoc, stitched together from documented fragments. On the night he decided to listen to the entire tape until the end, he put on the headphones, closed his eyes, and let the voice guide him. The recording wasn't just narrative, it was instruction. Between the phrases, there were calibrated pauses, noises that couldn't be consciously perceived, and in the final sequence, a tone below the audible threshold that, according to technical reports, served as a rewriting anchor. At the end of that session, Alan emerged from the chair, sweating, and with the sensation that something inside him had released a safety button. He saw the chronology. When did he start noting with such obsession? When did his signature multiply in reports? And more, there was an entry that left him stunned. Observation, subject presence tendency toward meta-narrative, possible risk factor for protocol integrity, partial isolation recommended. Who had written that? And why? The next morning, the laboratory clock showed a different date from the one he remembered. 3 weeks ago, declared the sheet in the corner of the table. In the diary, pages he swore he had written were now blank. In others, texts he didn't recognize were there, like letters written by a man who had agreed to forget. In the margins, a phrase engraved with trembling ink. To hear is to remember is to be. Alan realized with a fierce and painful clarity that the true experiment might not be just about erasing memories, but building entire lives on top of chosen voids. The tape continued playing, indifferent to his despair, repeating in echo the sentence that now seemed to him the ultimate promise and threat. If you're hearing this, Alan, it's because you've already begun to forget. When he turned off the device, only the muffled hum of the machines remained, but the phrase echoed in his head like a permanent residence. He stood up, his body light and strange, as if some connection had been cut. In the pocket of his overcoat, there was a piece of paper with a single scribbled word: restart. When Alan awoke, the world was in silence. A total silence, so deep it seemed to have thickness. The clock showed January 17th, 1953, and the diary on the table was clean, without any of the notes he remembered writing. On the cover, the inscription, Project Mnemosyne, Session 01. For a few seconds, he believed he had slept for days, but he soon noticed his body didn't show fatigue. The air was colder, the sound of the lamp stronger, and the laboratory, which before was worn by time, now seemed new, organized, immaculate. Even the smell was different, no longer mold and disinfectant, but the clean odor of fresh paint and static electricity. Everything gave the sensation of a restart, as if the previous days had been erased from within. But what truly disturbed him was Cameron's presence. The director was there, standing beside the window, his lab coat impeccable, a neutral smile. "Good morning, Dr. Collins." The voice sounded like a distant echo of itself, too polished, too rehearsed. Alan took a few seconds to respond. "I thought you had traveled." Cameron raised an eyebrow. "Travel? No, we've just begun. Are you ready for the first session?" Alan felt the floor slip away. First session. The same term he had heard before, that he had noted, that he had lived. It was as if everything were repeating but slightly displaced, like a recording played at a different speed. "Excuse me, but we've already conducted session 47. "Indeed." Cameron smiled, and the smile was almost pitying. "Session 47? There's nothing like that here, Alan. Perhaps a dream. Dreams often infiltrate memories during prolonged sleep." "Prolonged?" Alan didn't ask what he meant by that. Deep down, he already knew. Cameron led him through the corridors. The institute seemed the same, and at the same time, it wasn't. The lights seemed whiter, the doors more symmetrical, and the faces of the staff identical, but expressionless. No one spoke. Conversations seemed replaced by short gestures and gazes that never met. In the testing room, the equipment was prepared. Headphones, meters, tapes, everything perfectly aligned, as if it had never been used. However, Alan recognized every detail. The scratch on the table, the oil stain under the recorder, the exact sound the chair made when moved. He sat down slowly, trying to keep his breathing steady. "We'll begin with the induction track," said Cameron, adjusting the dials. The sound filled the air. It was the same deep, continuous noise that had accompanied him from the beginning. Only now there was something more, a structure behind it. Overlapping layers, almost as if another recording were being played at the same time, at an inaudible frequency. Alan closed his eyes, and then for an instant he saw something. A corridor flooded with red light, a metal door with the number 47, and a voice, his, repeating softly, "Restart." He opened his eyes suddenly. Cameron observed him with the calm of a surgeon. "Is everything all right, Alan? What is this recording, exactly?" "The basis of the research, the sound that reorganizes trauma, the sound that erases fear." Alan breathed deeply. "Or the sound that erases the man." Cameron didn't respond. He just stared at him with that look of someone who has heard this before, perhaps dozens of times. The following hours dissolved into fragments. Alan remembered having listened to the tapes, having noted sensations, then flashes, the reflection of his own face in the laboratory glass, the waves oscillating on the oscilloscope, and Cameron in the background, taking notes. When he awoke, he was alone again, with his head throbbing and the diary open before him. In it, a new entry had appeared, in handwriting that was his, but seemed written by another hand. "Session 47, successfully completed. The subject has been reinserted." Alan leafed through the following pages and found dates that hadn't yet arrived, entries describing events he hadn't yet lived, and at the end, an isolated phrase, "Memory is a circle, sound is its wall." It was then that he understood. The experiment wasn't linear. He was trapped inside a repetition, perhaps a series of layers overlapping in time, like tapes re-recorded countless times over the same reel. Each restart was an attempt to reconstruct something that disintegrated with each cycle. In the following days, he began to observe details that didn't match. The same employee passing in the same corridor with the same papers. The same patient sitting in the garden reading the same page of the same book. The same distant sound of a recording being rewound. Everything was trapped in a loop. Alan tried to escape. He went downstairs, crossed corridors, opened doors he swore he'd never seen, but all led back to the same point, the laboratory. And in its center, always the tape playing, always the same voice, his. If you're hearing this, Alan, it's because you've already begun to forget. He realized then that the true purpose of Project Mnemosyne wasn't to restore memories nor to erase traumas. It was to fabricate continuity, to keep alive fragments of a mind that no longer existed whole. And he was merely the body sustaining the echo, the sound that remained of a man who had been replaced by recordings. When Cameron returned, Alan asked, "How many times have I already lived this?" The director looked at him for a moment with a slight smile. "As many as necessary, until you remember to forget." Mornings became indistinguishable from one another. The sun crossed the Institute's windows always at the same angle, the same pale brightness, the same dust suspended in the air. Alan no longer noted the dates. He had given up pretending that time was still a straight line. Now time was a circle, and he was trapped inside it, like a tape that spins endlessly on a recorder no one operates anymore. In the first days, he tried to resist. He wrote long sentences, invented new words, drew symbols in the margins of pages, anything that could prove there was still an I inside that body. But the sentences began to repeat. The drawings became identical to those from the day before. Even the errors were the same, as if the very act of resisting had already been predicted. One night, he decided to follow the sound. The noise, that hum that never left him, seemed to have an origin. It didn't come from the machines, nor from the corridor, nor from the wind outside. It came from below, from the Institute's basement. He went down the stairs with a flashlight in hand. The lights flickered, and the air smelled of dust and rust. The sound grew as he advanced, pulsing like a heart. He reached a metal door without identification, locked with an old padlock. Beside it, a rusted sign, Cognitive Echo Laboratory, Restricted Access. Alan didn't hesitate. He forced the lock with a piece of iron until it gave way. The sound received him on the other side, dense, almost physical. It was the same sound from the tape, only more alive, more vast, as if the entire recording had been a domesticated version of this underground roar. Inside, there were dozens of recorders playing simultaneously. Tapes wound, crossed, devoured each other, and on all of them the same voice, his. If you're hearing this, Alan, it's because you've already begun to forget. He walked among the machines, touching the metal casings, feeling their heat under his fingers. On each device, a variation of himself. Different tones, altered breaths, pauses he didn't remember making, and all said the same thing. It was like hearing successive versions of a man being gradually replaced by his own echo. In the center of the room, there was a larger recorder, isolated from the others, with a tape marked by hand, Session 0. Alan remained motionless for a few seconds. He felt that everything he had lived, the notes, the repetitions, the visions, the restart, converged to that moment. He turned the knob. The initial noise seemed to come from the air itself, vibrating inside his chest, as if his lungs filled with frequencies. Then a voice, older, more tired, but unmistakably his. If you've gotten this far, it means the layers have broken. This is ground zero. You are not the subject. You are the sound. Alan recoiled, his heart racing. The tape continued, Mnemosyne wasn't about healing. It was about preserving, not people, but voices. Memory is just the form that sound finds to remain. The noise increased. The machines began to vibrate, the meters spinning wildly. Alan tried to turn off the equipment, but the button didn't respond. The tapes moved by themselves, and now his own voice came from all directions. Dozens of tones, ages, intentions. Some pleaded, others laughed. One very close whispered behind him, "You never left, Alan. We just changed the recording." He turned. No one. The room began to distort, the walls trembling under the pressure of sound. The lights flickered, and for an instant he saw Cameron's reflection in a glass, observing, taking notes. But the director's face seemed ancient, as if he had aged decades since their last meeting. Or perhaps it was just a recording too. Alan understood finally. The cycle wasn't temporal. It was auditory. Each time he restarted, the Institute simply played a new version of himself, recorded over the previous one. The man he had been before had been erased countless times, replaced by successive layers of voice and memory. The current Alan was just the latest reproduction, the most recent tape of a consciousness that degraded with each new iteration. The sound became deafening, the floor vibrated, and in the midst of chaos, he did something none of the previous versions had tried. He removed the session 0 tape from the recorder and broke it in half. The noise ceased immediately. Silence. The first true silence Alan had heard in months, perhaps years. But the silence didn't bring peace. It brought absence. Gradually, he realized he no longer remembered where he was, nor who he was. The diary on the table was blank, the room motionless. And inside his head, something began to erase itself, not like a common forgetting, but as if the very fabric of perception were being reeled back into itself. Before the darkness took him completely, he heard one last voice. Weak, distant, metallic. Perhaps his, perhaps from another recording. "Congratulations, Dr. Collins. The protocol has been successfully completed. The tape is clean." The sound dissolved, and the world with it. In the laboratory above, Cameron observed the motionless recorder. He collected the broken tape, wrote on the label, "Session 48, completed," and stored it on the shelf next to the others, all marked with the same name, A. Collins. The hum returned. A new tape began to spin,